What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors finally reaches his breaking point on live television? What you're about to witness is the moment Will Smith's famous smile disappeared forever, replaced by something far more dangerous. It all started in the deceptively calm moments before the cameras rolled, when a talk show host thought he could push America's favorite son just a little too far. The Jimmy Kimmel live studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy that Tuesday evening. But something felt different in the air. Will Smith sat in the green-walled guest waiting area, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, staring at the monitor displaying the show's opening credits. The characteristic warmth that had made him America's sweetheart for decades was nowhere to be found. Instead, his jaw was set in a way that his longtime publicist recognized as a warning sign, the same expression he'd worn during the aftermath of that Oscar night that changed everything. Across the studio, Jimmy Kimmel paced behind his desk, shuffling through note cards with the predatory excitement of a hunter who'd spotted wounded prey. His writers had done their homework tonight, digging deep into the recent tabloid headlines, the social media speculation, the whispered industry gossip about Smith's marriage, his career struggles, his desperate attempts to rebuild his shattered public image. Kimmel's producer had cautioned him to tread carefully, but the host dismissed the concerns with a wave of his hand. This was exactly the kind of television that kept his ratings high and his name trending on social media. The studio audience settled into their seats, most of them unaware they were about to witness television history. They'd come expecting the usual blend of celebrity promotion and light comedy, perhaps a few harmless jabs at Smith's recent missteps. None of them could have imagined they were about to see one of Hollywood's most controlled performers completely lose that control on live television. In his dressing room, Smith's security detail exchanged worried glances. They'd worked with him long enough to read the signs, the way his shoulders had tensed during the pre-interview briefing, the clipped responses he'd given to Kimmel's producers, the dangerous quiet that had settled over him like a storm cloud. One of them suggested they could still leave, claim a sudden illness, reschedule for another time, but Smith shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving his reflection in the mirror. "No," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made everyone in the room straighten. "It's time someone finally said what needs to be said." The floor manager's voice crackled through the studio speakers, calling places for the live broadcast. As Smith rose from his chair and walked toward the stage, the weight of years of accumulated frustration, betrayal, and public humiliation seemed to settle on his shoulders like armor. Tonight, the man who had spent decades making everyone else comfortable was about to make someone very, very uncomfortable indeed. The studio lights blazed hot as Will Smith settled into the guest chair, his movements precise and controlled, despite the tension radiating from every muscle in his body. The live audience applauded enthusiastically, their energy infectious in the way that only comes from being part of something happening in real time. But Smith's smile, the one that had charmed audiences for 3 decades, felt like a mask that no longer quite fit his face. Jimmy Kimmel bounced behind his desk with his trademark energy, feeding off the crowd's excitement like a performer who knew he owned the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, Will Smith," he announced, gesturing broadly toward his guest. "Now, Will, it's great to have you here. You look good, man. Really good, considering everything you've been through lately." The word everything hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Smith's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "Thanks for having me, Jimmy. Good to be here." Kimmel leaned back in his chair, his expression one of false concern mixed with barely concealed anticipation. "So let's just address the elephant in the room right away, because I know our audience is curious. It's been a tough couple of years. For you, hasn't it? The Oscar incident, the career setbacks, all the speculation about your personal life." Smith's hands, resting on the armrests of his chair, slowly tightened their grip. "Jimmy, I'm here to talk about my new project. That's what we discussed with your producers." Of course, Kimmel said with that practiced laugh that had helped him deflect uncomfortable moments for years. "But you can't expect people not to be interested in the real Will Smith story. I mean, you were America's golden boy. And then—" He let the sentence trail off with a theatrical shrug. The temperature in Smith's voice dropped several degrees. "Then what, Jimmy?" Kimmel sensed the shift, but pressed forward anyway, mistaking Smith's controlled tone for resignation rather than the warning it actually was. Well, then everything kind of fell apart, didn't it? The marriage rumors, the career struggles, the public meltdowns. People are wondering if you're okay, Will. Really okay. Smith leaned forward slightly, his famous charisma replaced by something far more dangerous. Let me be very clear about something, Jimmy. My family, my marriage, my personal struggles, that's not entertainment for your audience. That's my life. The host's grin never wavered, but something flickered behind his eyes, a recognition that perhaps he was standing on less solid ground than he'd assumed. Hey, I'm just asking the questions people want answers to. It's not personal. It's just television. Everything is personal when it's your life being dissected for laughs, Smith replied, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. The jovial atmosphere that had filled the studio moments before was rapidly evaporating, replaced by something that felt much more volatile. Kimmel's eyes lit up with the cruel excitement of a predator who had just spotted weakness in his prey. Smith's warning, rather than deterring him, seemed to embolden the host. The studio audience could feel the shift in energy, conversations dying mid-whisper as they sensed something dangerous building between the two men on stage. "Look, Will, I get it," Kimmel said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "You want to keep things private. But when you're one of the biggest stars in the world, privacy becomes a luxury, doesn't it? Especially when there are rumors flying. About you and Jada. About the kids. About whether your family is even still together." Smith's entire body went rigid. The mention of his wife's name in that context, delivered with Kimmel's trademark smirk, hit him like a physical blow. His jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables. "Don't," he said quietly, but the single word carried more menace than most people could manage in an entire sentence. "Don't what?" Kimmel pressed, leaning forward with that predatory smile. "Don't talk about the things that are already being talked about everywhere else? Come on, Will, the internet is full of speculation about your marriage. People are saying Jada's been seen without her wedding ring, that you two are living separate lives. Wouldn't it be better to set the record straight?" The color drained from Smith's face, then returned as a flush of barely controlled rage. Several audience members in the front row actually leaned back in their seats, instinctively recognizing that they were witnessing something that was about to go very wrong. "My wife's name," Smith said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more authority than shouting, "is not going to come out of your mouth again tonight. Do you understand me?" But Kimmel had tasted blood in the water, and years of successfully pushing celebrities past their comfort zones had made him reckless. "And what about Jaden and Willow? There's been talk about how your career troubles have affected them, about whether they're embarrassed by their father's public meltdowns. That's got to be tough on a parent, knowing your kids are seeing all this." Smith's hands slowly formed fists on the armrests of his chair. The studio lights seemed to intensify the sheen of sweat that had appeared on his forehead, and his breathing had become deliberately controlled, the kind of measured rhythm someone uses when they're fighting to maintain composure. Kimmel, misreading Smith's silence as capitulation rather than the calm before a storm, pushed even further. "I mean, let's be honest here, Will. You went from being everyone's favorite guy to being the punchline of every award show joke. That's got to do something to a man's psyche, right?" The question hung in the air like a lit fuse, and everyone in that studio could sense that something was about to explode. The silence that followed Kimmel's question stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Smith sat perfectly still, his chest rising and falling with the controlled breathing of someone who had spent years learning to manage explosive anger. The studio audience held its collective breath, sensing they were witnessing the final moments before something irreversible happened. Behind the cameras, Kimmel's executive producer frantically gestured, making slashing motions across his throat. Even from across the studio, he could see that Smith had reached a breaking point that no amount of editing could fix. But Kimmel, drunk on the adrenaline of what he believed was compelling television, ignored the warnings entirely. "I mean, that Oscar night really changed everything, didn't it?" Kimmel continued, his voice taking on the tone of false intimacy that had made him famous. "One moment of losing control, and suddenly everyone sees a different side of Will Smith. Makes people wonder what else you've been hiding, what other moments of rage might be lurking under that nice guy image. Smith's eyes slowly lifted to meet Kimmel's, and the host should have recognized the danger in that gaze. It was the look of a man who had been pushed beyond his limits, beyond caring about consequences or public image or career damage. It was the look of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "Jimmy," Smith said quietly, his voice carrying the eerie calm that often precedes violence, "I'm going to give you one last chance to change direction here. One last opportunity to remember that you're talking to a human being, not a character in your show." But Kimmel had committed to his path now, and something in Smith's restraint seemed to convince him that he was in control of the situation. "Oh, come on, Will, don't be so sensitive. We're all adults here. Everyone knows marriages go through rough patches. Everyone knows that sometimes people crack under pressure. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to keep pretending everything's fine? Or are you going to be honest with people who've supported you all these years?" The moment the word pretending left Kimmel's mouth, something fundamental shifted in Smith's posture. His shoulders squared, his spine straightened, and the mask of celebrity politeness that he'd worn for decades simply disappeared. What replaced it was something raw and authentic and absolutely terrifying. "Honest?" Smith repeated, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You want me to be honest, Jimmy?" Kimmel nodded eagerly, completely misreading the moment. "That's all I'm asking for. A little honesty." Smith slowly rose from his chair, his movement deliberate and predatory. Several audience members audibly gasped as his full presence filled the small stage, transforming him from a seated guest into something far more imposing. "Then let's be honest," Smith said, and everyone in that studio knew that whatever came next would change everything. The eruption, when it came, was like watching a dam burst after decades of pressure. Smith's voice exploded across the studio, with a fury that made every person present physically recoil. "You want honesty, Jimmy? Here's your honesty." Smith's words cut through the air like shrapnel. "You sit behind that desk night after night, picking apart people's lives like a vulture feeding on roadkill, and you call it entertainment." Kimmel's confident smirk evaporated instantly, replaced by wide-eyed terror as he found himself face to face with raw, unfiltered rage. He instinctively pushed his chair back from his desk, suddenly understanding that he had awakened something he couldn't control. "You think my pain is funny?" Smith continued, his voice rising to fill every corner of the silent studio. "You think my family's struggles are content for your show? My marriage, my children, my mistakes, they're all just material for your monologue, aren't they?" The host's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his usual arsenal of deflecting jokes, completely abandoned in the face of Smith's overwhelming presence. Behind the cameras, producers stood frozen, unsure whether they should cut to commercial or keep rolling on what was clearly becoming television history. "For 30 years I've played your game," Smith roared, beginning to pace in front of Kimmel's desk like a caged predator finally released. "I've smiled when you made jokes about my personal life. I've laughed when you turned my lowest moments into punchlines. I've sat in chairs just like this one and pretended it was all harmless fun, while people like you built careers on other people's misery." Several audience members had pulled out their phones despite the no-recording policy, recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Others simply sat in stunned silence, watching one of Hollywood's most beloved figures transform before their eyes into something elemental and furious. You know what the real joke is, Jimmy?" Smith stopped pacing and fixed Kimmel with a stare that made the host visibly shrink in his chair. "It's that you actually think you matter. You think because you have this platform, because you wear a suit and sit behind that desk, that gives you the right to judge other people's lives." Kimmel finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Will, maybe we should take a break." "No." Smith's hand slammed down on Kimmel's desk with such force that the host's coffee mug jumped and spilled across his note cards. "You wanted to have this conversation on live television, so let's have it. Let's talk about what you really are, Jimmy. Let's talk about the coward who hides behind jokes when he's destroying people's reputations." The studio had fallen so quiet that the hum of the cameras seemed deafening. Even the crew members had stopped moving, transfixed by the complete reversal of power happening before their eyes. "You're about to learn what happens when you push the wrong person too far," Smith said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The fury that had consumed Smith moments before transformed into something far more terrifying. Cold, surgical. Precision. His voice dropped to a level that somehow commanded more attention than his shouting had, each word delivered with the calculated impact of a master performer who understood exactly how to destroy someone in front of an audience. "You know what I did before I came here tonight, Jimmy?" Smith asked, his tone conversational now, which made it infinitely more menacing. "I did my research. I looked into you, just like you've been looking into me, and what I found was fascinating." Kimmel sat frozen in his chair, sweat beading on his forehead under the studio lights. His usual confidence had completely evaporated, leaving behind only a middle-aged man who suddenly looked very small and very afraid. "Did you know that your own staff calls you the Vulture behind your back?" Smith continued, beginning to circle Kimmel's desk like a predator, stalking wounded prey. "They've got a whole group chat dedicated to warning each other when you're in one of your moods, when you're looking for someone to humiliate for content." The host's face had gone pale, his eyes darting desperately toward his producers, who stood helplessly in the wings. Several audience members leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every word of this systematic character assassination. "And the guests, Jimmy. Oh, the stories I heard about the guests." Smith's smile was sharp and cruel. "Young actors who left your show in tears because you ambushed them about their personal lives. Comedians who specifically avoid booking appearances, here because they know you'll try to tear them down to build yourself up." Kimmel's voice cracked when he tried to respond. "That's not... I don't what? Don't remember making that teenage actress cry when you kept pushing her about her eating disorder. Don't remember the comedian who asked you to stop talking about his divorce and you just kept going anyway?" Smith's voice grew louder, filling the silent studio. "Or maybe you don't remember because there have been so many victims that they all blur together." The audience was completely silent now, watching this methodical destruction with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a public execution. Several had stopped recording, too caught up in the raw intensity of the moment to think about capturing it. "You built your entire career on other people's pain, Jimmy. You're not a comedian, you're a parasite. You feed off trauma and call it entertainment." Smith stopped directly in front of Kimmel's desk, towering over the cowering host. "And tonight, for the first time in your pathetic career, someone's fighting back." Kimmel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had finally encountered someone who couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be manipulated, and wouldn't be silenced. "We're not done yet," Smith said quietly, and somehow that promise carried more weight than any threat he could have made. Smith began unbuttoning his suit jacket with deliberate, theatrical precision, the simple gesture somehow carrying the weight of finality. The movement snapped Kimmel out of his paralyzed terror, desperation giving him one last surge of misguided courage. "Wait, Will, just wait," Kimmel stammered, his voice cracking as he half rose from his chair. This is my show. You can't just come here and attack me like this. Security!" Smith's laugh was low and genuinely amused, the sound more chilling than his earlier rage had been. "Security? You're calling security on your guest because he's telling the truth about you, because he won't play along with your little game anymore?" The host looked desperately toward the wings, but his security team remained conspicuously absent. Even they seemed to understand that intervening in this moment would only make things worse for their employer. "Listen to me very carefully, Jimmy," Smith said, removing his microphone pack with the same calculated precision. "This isn't your show anymore. This is your reckoning, and these people," he gestured toward the audience, "they're finally seeing who you really are." Kimmel made one final pathetic attempt to salvage his dignity. "The audience loves this show. They love me. You're just having a breakdown on television." The words hung in the air for a moment before Smith turned to address the studio audience directly, his voice carrying the full power of 3 decades of commanding stages and screens. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you something," he said, his presence filling every corner of the studio. "How many of you came here tonight expecting to see Jimmy Kimmel tear apart another guest for entertainment? How many of you were hoping to see me humiliated for your amusement?" An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the crowd as people shifted in their seats, suddenly forced to confront their own complicity in the spectacle they'd come to witness. "This man," Smith continued, pointing at Kimmel without even looking at him, "makes millions of dollars destroying people's reputations and privacy. He profits from other people's pain, and you've been his willing audience. But tonight you got to see what happens when the prey fights back." Several audience members began to nod, their expressions shifting from entertainment to understanding, then to something approaching shame. The tide in the room had turned completely, and Kimmel could feel it happening in real time. "Jimmy," Smith said, finally turning back to the host, who had sunk into his chair like a deflated balloon. "You wanted honesty. Here's the most honest thing I can tell you. After tonight, everyone will remember exactly what kind of person you really are." Smith began walking toward the exit, but his final words carried clearly across the silent studio. "And they'll remember what it looks like when someone finally stands up to a bully." Will Smith walked off that stage like a man who had just shed 30 years of accumulated weight. His stride was confident, purposeful, transformed from the tense, guarded figure who had entered the studio less than an hour before. The studio lights seemed to follow him as he moved, casting him in an almost heroic silhouette against the backdrop of stunned silence he left in his wake. Behind him, Jimmy Kimmel sat alone at his desk, looking smaller than anyone had ever seen. Him, the confident host who had started the evening believing he could control and manipulate his guest, was gone, replaced by a middle-aged man whose career had just been systematically dismantled on live television. His hands trembled as he gripped the edges of his desk, his note cards scattered and coffee-stained, worthless reminders of the show he had planned but would never deliver. The studio audience remained frozen in their seats, many still processing what they had just witnessed. Some were openly filming now, understanding they had been present for a moment that would be dissected and analyzed for years to come. Others sat in contemplative silence, forced to confront their own role as willing participants in a system of entertainment built on humiliation and exploitation. As Smith reached the edge of the stage, he paused and turned back one final time. The gesture was theatrical, perfectly timed, the mark of a performer who understood exactly how to leave an indelible impression. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the silent studio, clear and strong and utterly without regret. "You know what the beautiful thing about live television is," he said, addressing both Kimmel and the millions watching at home. "You can't edit out the truth. Every word that was said here tonight, every moment of cowardice, every second of this man's humiliation, it's all been broadcast to the world. And unlike your usual victims, Jimmy, I'm not going to apologize for defending myself." Kimmel tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but no sound emerged. His famous quick wit, his arsenal of jokes and deflections, had completely abandoned him when he needed them most. The audience began to stir, some rising from their seats as if uncertain whether the show was over or if they should applaud. The confused energy in the room reflected the historic nature of what had just occurred, the sense that normal rules no longer applied. As Smith disappeared into the wings, Kimmel was left facing the cameras that were still rolling, still broadcasting, his complete and utter defeat to millions of viewers. The silence stretched on, broken only by the hum of equipment and the shuffling of an audience that no longer knew what they were supposed to feel. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Kimmel looked directly into the camera and managed to croak, We'll be right back." But everyone knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again.